This is a short video to introduce you to the behavioral determinants framework we'll be using in class. We'll call it BDF for short. BDF as in Behavioral Determinants Framework. Now, BDF is not a theory. BDF is a tool built on theories. It is a tool we use for influencing how people behave, influencing the choices they make. Like, what's the best snack? A slice of pizza, cookies, or kale? You and I know it's a slice of pizza, right? But it turns out kale is pretty damn healthy. So someone might want to get us to eat kale, for our own good, of course. You might remember this from your childhood. Your mom, she definitely wants you to eat kale. Now, the typical way someone might approach this is to try and persuade you, to tell you it's healthy, as if you didn't know that already. The Behavioral Determinants Framework, or BDF, it takes a different approach. Instead of persuasion, we try to identify the behavioral determinant. That is, the force that's influencing our decision to, for example, eat pizza instead of kale. I'm guessing you didn't choose pizza because it's healthier. You chose it because it tastes better, especially if it's not that crappy Papa John's stuff. So the behavioral determinant, the reason you chose pizza, is the perceived consequence, that warm, greasy, cheesy, salty taste you can't get enough of. And so our intervention would be to address that behavioral determinant to influence what is influencing you. Maybe we can make kale taste better. Put it in a yummy salad with a great dressing, for example. At its core, BDF works like a checklist, a list of 12 categories of behavioral determinants. These are 12 common factors that influence what people do. They influence all different kinds of behaviors, from getting a vaccine to voting to joining an environmental group. We use audience research to identify which factors are active, that is, which behavioral determinants matter for a specific behavior. Then we devise strategies to manipulate those select influences. Interventions are aimed not at behaviors directly, but at behavioral determinants. Instead of begging people to change, we influence the influences that influence them. This list of behavioral determinants at the heart of BDF originated way back in 1991, back in the era of Fresh Prince, the Gulf War, and the AIDS epidemic. The AIDS epidemic had drawn a social scientist named Marty Fishbein to the National Institute of Mental Health. Fishbein had made a name for himself in social psychology, developing the expectancy value model in the 1960s, and later with Isaac Eisen, the landmark theory of reasoned action. In 1991, while most of the attention was on finding a cure for AIDS, Fishbein was working with NIMH on trying to prevent HIV in the first place. And that meant influencing behavior in the most intimate of contexts, sex. Fishbein wanted to ground the work on prevention in theory, which is how he found himself in 1991 working with the Institute to hold a theorist workshop. Besides Fishbein, the leading theorists invited were Albert Bandura, the father of the social cognitive model, Marshall Becker, who'd advanced the health belief model, Frederick Canfer, an Austrian-born clinical psychologist who had upended his field advocating for patients to take a role in their own treatment, and Harry Triandis, a pioneer in cross-cultural psychology. Not the most diverse group, it's 5 white men, but at the time, these men were all big players in social psychology. The workshop lasted 3 days. In the end, they agreed 8 variables appear to account for most of the variance in any given deliberate behavior. One of the variables was behavioral intent. The other 7 formed the foundation for the 12 factors that now make up the BDF. The framework evolved from there. A wider set of theories were incorporated from multiple fields. Adjustments were made to provide better guidance to people in the field. People used the framework, and that led to changes. We'll talk more about all these theories in class. Here's the framework today. That 1991 theorist workshop laid down 7 foundational determinants. Let me describe those first. Of course, what we do is impacted by what's around us. That is what we describe as the environment determinant. We're more likely to go to the gym if it's open and close by. In general, people favor what's accessible, noticeable, supported, or triggered by environmental cues. Then there's emotion. We all seek various shades of joy and acceptance and are triggered by feelings like anger, fear, anticipation, and surprise. Just associating a behavior with an emotion can have a powerful effect as both a motivator and a trigger. Perceived consequences may seem like an obvious determinant of behavior. We are influenced by what we expect will happen as a result of our actions, the anticipated outcomes of what we do. But it's amazing how often this carrot or stick bottom line is forgotten. Simply put, people seek rewards and avoid problems. The sooner and more certain the reward, the more powerful the pull. One of the most powerful determinants of behavior are social norms. As social beings, we can't help but look to our peers. We are influenced by what we think others do and by what we think they expect of us, what social scientists defined as descriptive and injunctive norms. Self-standards are like personal norms. We act to define ourself to ourself and others. Think virtue signaling. You're not just doing it for others. You are also doing it for your own self-image. Skills are the know-how or ability you need to do something, whether it's baking bread or putting on a condom. Apart from your actual skills is your self-confidence or self-efficacy. In fact, the feeling of mastery once achieved is a powerful motivator to engage in a behavior, and the fear of failure is a powerful inhibition. In his landmark theory of planned behavior, which we will talk more about later in this course, Isaac Eisen uses the term perceived behavioral control. I like this term because it captures both a person's confidence in their ability, what we describe as self-efficacy, and their perception that a behavior is under their control. They can do it and they have that choice. In BDF, we break out control from efficacy as its own determinant because it can operate independently. Experiments have shown that giving people a sense of control, for example, offering choices or even the option to refuse a request, makes them more likely to fully engage in a behavior. Risk is really just a form of perceived consequence, but we use risk as its own category in the BDF. Here's why. With risk, the focus is less on the outcome and more on whether that outcome will actually happen. The whole field of risk perception centers on this calculation, the likelihood of an adverse event. If the focus is the reward or penalty expected, that's what we describe as perceived consequence. Risk is all about how likely a bad thing is to happen. Risk is a common but typically weak leverage point in public health and environmental campaigns. So many campaigns warn that if you do X, terrible things will happen. But there's a lot of warnings out there. Risk is a crowded category. People have a ton to worry about, so they tune out warnings. Who's shopping for another thing to worry about? We also hear a lot today about another determinant, social identity. This category of behavioral determinant goes back to Henry Tajfel's social identity theory, and it has only increased in importance as American politics has become more tribal. The basic idea here is that affinity with social groups influences our perceptions and behaviors. We cherry-pick data to protect our identity and boost our perceived value to others. Social identity even colors our perceptions of scientific evidence, regardless of our level of literacy with the topic. Social identity has a lot to do with social norms and one's self-standard, but we break it out as its own category in the BDF. This is because it operates differently than norms and self-standards. The driver is belonging. It's also an influence that is triggered. After all, we are all part of many groups. It's just a matter of whether we are triggered to think of another person as one of us or the other. The application to today's political environment is obvious. Finally, we need to recognize that behaviors are often chosen intuitively, without reflection, using instinct and mental shortcuts. Humans need shortcuts to lighten their cognitive load, essentially to think less, preserve calories. Everything can't be a giant decision. These shortcuts are called heuristics, and the results are biases so universal they can predict human behavior. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman showed this in his work with Amos Tversky, starting with prospect theory and popularized in his bestseller Thinking Fast and Slow. For example, confirmation bias. We all tend to take note of information that confirms our initial thinking and disregard information that challenges it. Of course, many biases and heuristics still hark back to other determinants. But since these biases operate so predictably, we break them out in the BDF. This is all captured in what we now call behavioral economics. The idea is that we can nudge people to do what we want by playing to these biases. And as in economics in general, the BDF breaks out the power of cost, or as we call it, investments. The perceived cost of an action in money, time, social capital, or even cognitive load may lead to action or inaction depending on the situation. To achieve a sense of accomplishment, we often tend to finish things we've already invested time and energy in. On the other hand, people gravitate to what requires less of them. So there's a lot there in the BDF, a lot of history, but also a lot going on today. This is a living framework informed every day by the thinking, discussions, and experiments happening in social psychology, neuroscience, and behavioral economics. In this third column, we lay out the guiding fields and theory base of the BDF by determinant. This is where we can explore more to get a deeper understanding of both what's behind each determinant and how to use it. We'll explore all of this during the first half of this semester. For now, just remember this. BDF is not a theory. It's a tool built on theories. The BDF approach is not about persuasion. BDF is about influencing the factors, the determinants, that influence action. BDF is centered on 12 common behavioral determinants: environment, emotion, perceived consequences, social norms, self-standards, skills, self-efficacy, control, risk, social identity, investment, and bias and heuristics.